I'm saying that the best values of the society that we created did not die. And while we get into European this and European that, we forgot that before the first European wore a shoe or lived in a house that had a window, we already had functioning societies before these people even existed. How can you sit still and let some foreigner claim they built the pyramids when they hadn't built a shoe for themselves in Europe or a house with a window? Hadn't even written a book. Please. Now we're at the crossroads debating something because we have not looked at it and examined the history of our countries well enough to understand we have already done what people are saying should be done today. And we don't have to argue between Marx and Leninism because we produced a substance and practiced it long before there was a Europe. There's some confusion between the Karl Marxes and the Groucho Marxes. The Grouchos seem to be making the most noise, while the Karl Marxes seem to be in retreat. Why don't we tell people we've been around this track before? What you got to say? We never formalized things. We never dogmatized things. We just lived it out. With the first invasion of Africa from Western Asia, mistakenly called the Middle East today, in the 1700s BC, then again in the 1600s BC, the coverage of the second invasion was 665 BC, and finally the invasion from Iran, then called Persians, about 550 BC, so devastated Northeast Africa. It opened the door for the Greek with a gender problem, Alexander, who then began to copy African history, African ceremonies, began to wear the toga. Then the Romans would later pick up the idea of the toga from the African. Finally, how they forced Christianity into being through taxation and misery. Finally, they stopped killing Christians and became Christians for political reasons. And the Europeans are still Christians for political reasons. And why are you following behind their Christianity, not knowing that their Christianity is some fakery dreamed up at the Conference of Nicaea, 325 AD? It is not Christianity at all. It's the handmaiden of their conquest. Finally, they made such a mess of it. A camel boy began to grumble, asking for reform. Failing to get reform, he asked for a new religion. That new religion was Islam. Now Africa is in another power trap of history. The Africans favored the Arabs at first. The Africans were in Spain. Understand this, because most of you will not read history. The Africans were in Spain, well entrenched, 50 to 55 years before the Arabs. The general was Tariq bin Azad, known as Jabal al-Tariq. As a matter of fact, the Rock of Gibraltar is named after him. There's a classic work written by a Turkish woman, Halle Bagiba. She said the army was as black as ink. The general was black as steel. So is there any confusion of who these people were? The general was Tarak bin Azad, and she wrote a book bearing his name, Tarak bin Azad. Now, why did the general look blacker than the rest of them? His horse was dressed better than the kings of Europe. His horse was silk and brocade. He was riding a white horse. The others had a different kind of horse. This white horse showed off his blackness. Maybe one day Hollywood will have the chutzpah to put that in a movie. The ladies were so impressed, each one began pulling off their garments and throwing them at the feet of the horse. You know, I'm available. Yeah, I think Africa's going to have to own part of Hollywood before that movie gets made. But that would last almost 800 years. But the rise of Europe after the Crusades would put us into another bind. Europe rose, discovered shipbuilding again, started the slave trade, and began to scatter Africans throughout the world. We had been scattered voluntarily throughout the world, through adventures and voluntarily. Now we are being scattered as slaves. We're in another bind now, and we will not come out of this bind. The 19th century would bring us back to African consciousness again, something now mistakenly called Afrocentricity. It's African consciousness, because you should not avoid using the word African, all of it. Don't use no fro. Fro. But that 19th century in the Caribbean islands, with the massive revolts that brought Haiti into being, Africa's anti-colonial wars, Winston Churchill said that these Africans who never heard of a military school or wore a stole-bought shoe have out-generaled some of the finest minds of Europe. Now, at the end of the 19th century, Africans began to negotiate, appeal. These Christian Africans now, appealing to the conscience, the Christian conscience of the European, not understanding these bastards had no Christian conscience, and still don't. There was lack of Christian conscience that led them into the slave trade. Except in the word of the Pope, when he told Spain and Portugal, you are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. The authorization for slavery came from the church. And Eric Williams is very good on this. Read his documents, his book, The Caribbeans from Columbus to Castro, and his other book, Slavery and Capitalism, and also John Henrik Clark's book, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. The documents are very good. Darren Carew's new book, The Conquest of Paradise, or The Destruction of Paradise. No shortage of information. All you gotta do is read it.